Hi everyone, today I'm going to show you how to use stitch markers. There's something you see around a lot. You get some really cute and really pretty different stitch markers, and aside from that they're a really great tool to have in your knitting. So I'm going to chat a little bit with you about how to use stitch markers in your knitting or crochet to make your life easier. But first I'm going to show you how to actually use a stitch marker as well, because this is actually a question I get a lot, so I thought I'd show you exactly how they work in your knitting. So with stitch markers you get two different kinds. And they might look different depending on how they've been made, but basically you'll get one like this that is a closed ring. They're normally on a ring or some kind of shape, like there's no opening on this ring here for one kind of stitch marker, which you use for knitting only. And then there's the variety that you also use in knitting, but you can also use in crochet, that is on some kind of clasp or clip, something that you can open like this one. So you can open it up and actually stick it through a stitch and then remove it later on. So these ones are often called removable stitch markers, and these ones often don't have the word removable associated with them, which also leads to another question I get a lot, which is how do I get it out of my knitting afterwards? So I'm going to show you first how to use this one in your knitting and also how to get it out at the end. So when you've got your knitting and you get to a place in the pattern that says place marker onto your needle, you're going to get one of these ones that is on a ring and put it onto your needle. This doesn't become part of your knitting because when you come to the marker, and you'll have this written in a lot of patterns, they'll have it written as slip marker. You just slip it over to the other side and you keep knitting. This ring isn't trapped in your knitting, it's every time you come around to it you're going to be able to get it off. So I'll just undo these stitches and show you. When you come back round to it, it's still loose and it's on your needle. So you've slipped your marker and then you're going to finish knitting around. So I've come back round another round and my stitch marker's coming up, and you'll see when you get here it's still completely loose. It's not in my knitting at all. I can actually completely remove it from the project now if I needed to. If I don't need to, I'm just going to slip it from one needle to the other and keep working. Now can be a little slightly bit trickier, but it's not hard at all to work when you're swapping between knitting and purling. So if you were doing rib and you've got a stitch marker, if I now had to bring my yarn to the front to purl and then I slip to my marker, my yarn's going to be going over the front of the marker, and it's going to make, when you've got a decorative stitch marker like this, it's going to make this part get caught under the thread of yarn. The really easy way around that is leave your yarn, if you're swapping from a knit to a purl stitch, leave your yarn at the back while you slip your marker and then bring your yarn to the front and continue purling. And the same goes if you're swapping from a purl to a knit. So if you're swapping, imagine you've been purling along and now you want to swap to knitting, rather than slipping the marker and then taking your yarn around, take your yarn to the back and then slip the stitch marker. The other thing you can do if you're actually purling and you come to the marker is slip it, and if it's got like a decorative charm on it like this one, just slip it on the back of the work while you purl on past, and then you can bring it back to the front where you can see it and it hasn't been caught by your yarn. So it's really easy to use them and they don't get trapped in your work. The only time they can get a little bit stuck is if swapping between stitches, but if you're just mindful of whether your yarn's crossing across the front of your marker or not, it won't be a problem. Now the other kind of stitch marker you have is these little ones with their clips on them. So you can open these up and actually slip them through a stitch. So if you need to mark a specific stitch in your row, this also works for crochet, you're actually going to open up your clip and put it through the stitch and close it up again. Now that stitch marker isn't going to be in a part of your work, as you keep knitting along, it's going to get further down and stay in that row of knitting because you've normally marked that spot for a specific reason. When you finish your project, it's really easy to remove them. You just undo the clip and pull it out of the stitch. So those are the removable ones, which do tend to be a bit more self-explanatory to use, and that's also how you use the ring markers. Now you know how to use the stitch markers, I'm going to show you a few different ways where they come really handy and make your knitting or crochet project a lot easier and more enjoyable. There's lots of ways you can use stitch markers. Obviously where a pattern outright calls for them, you always use them, but there's also lots of ways you can incorporate them into projects that don't ask you to use stitch markers, but where the use of a stitch marker will make it easier for you. So one example is this sock that I knitted. This is a sock with a lace panel running down the front of the sock. And even though it's a really easy pattern, so there was no call for stitch markers to be used, I wanted to have this project as sort of a lazy project that I could do anywhere, so to make it even easier I added stitch markers in. So what I did is, when you knit the sock, this side is the start of your round, so you knit this little lace repeat and then you have to count however many stitches in between each panel. It varies for your size. So rather than me having to count those every round, I decided to cheat and just put in a stitch marker after the lace panel on this side and then another one before the lace panel on this side. And that meant that I could just knit my little bit of lace, then mindlessly knit these stitches until I got to the marker. I was never having to count. And that was just one way that this pattern became something that I could do wherever and whenever. So that's one way you can use them. Obviously, to use one like that where I wanted it to be marked on every round, I used a stitch marker that went onto the needle with my work. I didn't use a removable one. Another way you can use these ones that are on the rings is when you're casting on a project and you've got lots of stitches to count, so you're casting on, you can put this on after every 25 or 50 stitches. This saves you a lot of counting, particularly if you're dealing with a project upward of 200, 300, 400 stitches. What you do is, if you put a stitch marker in after you've counted 50 every time, when you're counting along, you can just count it in blocks of 50, or if you lose your stitch count halfway through counting, you don't have to go all the way back to the beginning and restart. You can just count, well, I know there's 50 between that section and 50 between that section, and you can just start recounting the new section. It saves a lot of headache and a lot of hassle, and it's particularly handy if you're trying to knit and you've got a partner or friend there trying to talk to you while you're doing it. Another really obvious way that stitch markers on rings are often used is to mark the beginning of a round when you're knitting in the round. So because all of your work is joined, you'll pop the stitch marker on where the work begins, and that way you'll know that that's the beginning and end of each round. Clip-on markers can be used in projects like a garment project where you might want to mark a certain part of a stitch and leave it there and then return to it. So you might be working the underarm of a garment project and want to mark a certain section. So you'd clip the stitch through the stitch marker through the stitch, and it marks your spot. So it might be marking how many pattern repeats you did. So say you're working on a project and it's a 4-row repeat, you might actually go along, rather than you having to keep count on paper, you might actually go along and clip a marker on every row repeat so that you can just glance at it and know that there's 5 markers there and therefore you've done 5 repeats. So I hope that gives you a better idea of how you can incorporate stitch markers into your knitting and crochet projects. A quick note on stitch markers that are like this one. This is a style of stitch marker that I've just changed to having in my shop. This one actually functions as both a ring marker and a removable. So you can open it as a clasp, but because its clasp is actually really big, it also serves and is big enough to double up and slide around on your needle. So those are a really great little style of marker to look for. There's lots of different kinds of stitch markers available, some really pretty ones, there's more simple ones, and then there's fun cute little ones like these. So Now you can get some into your collection and you'll find your projects much easier to work on.